morning. Welcome to a discussion on sustainable development. When we talk about sustainable development, we talk about an alternative idea of development, critiquing of ongoing processes of development, and also simultaneously we talk about state and civil society intervention towards the development. In this lecture today, we shall be discussing first the trajectories of development in the society, developmental ideology and growth driven development. Then we'll talk about the limitations of the growth and consumption driven development in this world. We'll go further to delineate the patterns of unequal consumption, energy consumption, and contribution to carbon emission and environmental degradation that is set in motion by growth driven development. At the end, we'll be talking about the global concern for environmental sustainability, alternative perspective, that is sustainable perspective on development. In doing so, let us talk a little bit about the changing trajectory of development in society. As a student of sociology, you would be involved in the understanding that human society has made a lot of progress through varieties of transition, from savagery to barbarism, barbarism to civilization, from primitive to modern, from agrarian to industrial, from ancient to feudal, feudal to capitalism. Then we talk about the pre-industrial to industrial. Now what we talk about, it onward march towards a knowledge-driven society. Since 18th century onward, modernization and industrialization was considered to be the panacea of all social ills. The social ills of poverty, unemployment, backwardness, and also at times illiteracy. These are considered to be the social ills, and that can be taken care of by introducing the economy towards the process of modernization and industrialization. The process of modernization and industrialization was to be engineered by a developmental path that was founded on economic growth. And economic growth was considered synonymous to gross domestic product, and gross domestic product can be enhanced through production of goods and services and consumption of the goods and services. It is through the production cycle, it is through the production that it expands the market, and it creates the demand in the society. When there is more demand, there is more supply and more selling of the commodities and more consumption. And out of the more consumption, there is more and more profit. And that is widely expanded, used for the expansion of the market and the production system. In that way, economic growth contributed towards the process of economic development in the society. This perspective are widely taken into consideration in terms of an understanding of what we call an understanding of economic determinism. That economic determinism was linked, as I told, that is, it's linked to productivity, linked to expansion of the market of the economy, linked to industrial growth and profit, and this ultimately linked to the consumption. Consumption of all varieties of the goods, both what we call conspicuous consumption, what we call consumption without the boundary, what we call consumption in terms of the immediate need, also in terms of the by consuming the requirement of the future needs of the society. Now, in the process of this consumption, in the consumption-driven development, we found enormous contradiction and tension took place in this world that is linked to the ideology, power, and development. That is, whatsoever it was to be developed, it was developed in terms of certain ideology. The first ideology was widely contributed to what we call the capitalist world. The capitalist world, it was founded on the private ownership of the means of production, industrialization, and industrialization for the economic growth. Then we found this is widely spearheaded by the Western Europe and also the North American countries. Then we found another socialist world. Socialist world also emphasized on socialist mode of development, socialist form of development rather, talked about centralized planning, abolition of private property, and distributive justice. It also founded on the whole ideal of growth-driven development. Then we find another world, that is neither the part of the capitalist world nor the socialist world, they accepted both modes of this development, both patterns of development, worlds of development, that is the third world of development. It accepted the mixed economy. Some parts of the capitalist world, private ownership, some parts of the socialist world in terms of centralized planning. So it's also talked about the distributive justice and also people's development. So what we find, all these three worlds of development, that is talked about capitalist world, socialist world, and the third world, it was widely linked to what we call the growth-driven development, that is linked to the linked to the more and more production linked to the use of more and more energy consumption on this earth. What is important at this stage to emphasize that these models of development, the growth-driven models of development, it developed a worldwide market. The worldwide market led to the development of what we call world capitalism. And world capitalism was linked to the usage of energy at the cost of the nature. It also simultaneously expanded for the new market. It went to the world of colonizing the new market and went for colonization of the world. And ultimately, there was also a counter movement that became decolonized. So what we find linkages in the production process in terms of growth-driven development in the three world and alternative world, and that was founded on the consumption of more and more energy. Now, this developmental path, growth-driven developmental path, has thrown varieties of the challenges on this earth. The first challenge came in the form a contradiction between the developmental culture and the nature. The developmental culture, it talks about, as I told, that is development based on enriching the economic benefit, enriching the economic parameters of the society. And in the process of this developmental journey, there's a lot of contradiction with the nature, because this developmental culture use the raw material, you use the other kind of energies which are required, and ultimately brought a lot of distraction to the nature. So contradiction came between the developmental culture and the nature. When we talk about the culture, we not only talk about the music, art, we also talk about the science, the technology. So new science, new technology, new market become part of this developmental culture. Ultimately, it's brought a lot of contradiction with the nature. Second challenge came the increasing assault on the natural resources and the depleting basis of natural resources. So whatsoever our natural resources, the land, the forest, the water, the earth, it encountered the host of challenges with the interpenetration of this developmental journey, of this growth-driven developmental journey. Then it also brought to this world, it's brought to the notice of the world that there is limitation of the nature itself, because the limitation of the nature, it contributed to the a lot of distraction, as I told earlier, and its limitation also in terms of its process of regeneration. It was widely thought of that whatsoever the natural resources are consumed, whether it is consuming the forest, we are consuming the water, we are consuming the soil, changing the nature of the soil, but this nature is also having a kind of limitation. Ultimately, it leads to degeneration of varieties of the natural resources. Ultimately, it contributes to the varieties of the ecological imbalances. Ecological imbalances in the terms of widely talked about thinnings of the ozone layer, the drying of the rivers, the drying of the water bodies, and first melting of the snow, and then the climate change which is taking place across the globe. And those climate change are reflected in the form of untimely rain, then heavy snowfall at time, the droughts in many of the places. So what we find, this development has been accompanied by large-scale displacement of varieties of the indigenous people from their own habitat. When there is a dam, the big industries, railway tracks, it is widely noticed that the local people widely displaced out of this intervention of these developmental initiatives. It has also brought in varieties of pollution and natural disaster, flood and drought on this earth. It has also widely contributed to what we had looked into the pandemic. Recently, we were talking about the COVID-19, the widely known the corona pandemic. It is yet not clear whether it is a man-made or it's a natural. So the pandemic has created another kind of problem in this society. Notwithstanding this kind of pandemic, there is also another kind of disaster, mass killing of people, as we have seen in case of the Bhopal tragedy or Chernobyl in Russia, etc. places. So what it is looked into that all the developmental path, maybe the atomic energy, maybe it is a new kind of chemical production. These are required for the developmental initiative, but this has also brought varieties of catastrophes on this earth. Now, what we find that is economic growth, it has not been equal. Those who are socially vulnerable, they have been widely impacted, and their vulnerability has been used. And it has also widely contributed, that is what we call imbalanced development on this earth. That's why when there is a prosperity in some parts of the earth, prosperity for certain segment of the population, there has also been what we call a kind of social, economic, and political imbalances that is reflected in the form of increasing number of unemployed people in the composition of the population, increasing poverty, inequality in the society. Those are also widely linked in terms of energy consumption. When you talk about the modern development which is industrial development, which is developed in terms of modern tools and techniques, nothing can be developed, nothing can be enhanced without use of the energy. So at this level, let us know what kind of energy consumption this world is encountering. So energy consumption is linked to higher the energy consumption, higher is the economic growth. Okay. Higher is the energy consumption, also linked to higher amount of carbon emission. There is a higher amount of contribution to the what we call pollution on this earth. So let us go further to discuss how this unequal usage of energy has linked to unequal pattern of development, and it has contributed towards the growth of an unequal world that is linked to the growth-driven development. Energy consumption, when we talk about, that is also linked to energy inequality. That is production and consumption of energy, especially the biogas, the mineral and the fossil fuel. These are linked to the development, pollution and climate change. It is widely, this energy consumption, it is widely recognized that it contributes more than 60%. Its contribution is more than 60% to the greenhouse gases on this world. So it has also created an unequal world because the energy consumption has not been equal. It has created an unequal world, unequal north and the south, the rich and the poor. So energy overconsumption is linked to the affluence. Those who are the affluence section of the society, affluence part of the globe, they have consumed a higher amount of energy. Just the opposite, lower energy consumption is linked to the energy poverty, marginality and deprivation in the society. So energy is linked to the development. So higher usage of energy linked to the development, low usage of energy linked to the underdevelopment. But underdevelopment also linked to the environmental sustainability in one way or the other. So the changing energy use pattern among the poor in the world, what we find that is the changing energy consumption which is taking place in the contemporary world, that has also widely affected the relationship between the rich and the poor, rich nation and the poor nations in the country. Now at this stage, let us make just a quick comparative analysis of the energy use, CO2 emission, poverty in the selected countries in the world. When you talk about the development, growth-driven development, some of the countries usually come to our mind, that is US, Australia, Japan. Those are the countries, they're widely benefited with this growth-driven developmental perspective. Now, if we look into, that is per capita energy consumption in USA, if we look into it is in 2016, it was 7,050.6 per capita kilowatt energy consumption. And per capita GDP, if we look into that is per capita GDP of US, it was $43,004.6 per person per annum. It's a huge kind of energy consumption. It is linked to huge kind of GDP, per capita GDP in that country. 43,000 plus GDP per person in America. Then what is the share? That is share to the CO2, that is carbon emission. It is 16%. Now CO2 per capita, it is 15 ton. And if we look into people living below the poverty line, is non negligible. That is, it is people earning less than $2 per day. It comprises only 1.2% of the population. So what we find, higher amount of energy consumption is linked to higher per capita growth, but it has also linked to higher share in the capital, higher share in the carbon emission, in the pollution, and both per capita and also in the world share. Let us come to the Australia, that is another developed country. They also consume a higher amount of energy, that is 5,970.9, that is per capita energy consumption. That is per capita energy consumption is 5,970.9 kilowatt per person. And its GDP, it is higher than America, that is 57,305, that is the GDP. And CO2 emission world share only 1%. But per capita, it is higher than America, that is 16%. And for them, BPL people living below the poverty line is negligible. And if we consider in terms of the dollar, less than $2 per person per day, it is only 0.7%. Again, it comes to this conclusion that higher amount of per capita energy consumption leading to higher amount of per capita GDP, and simultaneously higher contribution towards the carbon emission, CO2 contribution. Japan follows more or less the similar kind of a path. It is like the US, Australia, and Japan, more or less in the same category. Japan, 3,700 per capita kilowatt per capita energy consumption. GDP, it is again 39,000 plus GDP per person. CO2 per individual only 4%. World share 9.9%. And it is only 0.2% people belong to the below poverty line. And let us come to China. China is another interesting case. It is one of the fast growing economy on this earth. It is also a higher amount of per capita energy consumption. That is 1,695.3 kilowatts per capita energy consumption, and its GDP to the extent of 9,770. It is quite high. It is what is CO2. It is 29% the world share. That is a huge quantum of world share, and it is per capita. It is quite low. It is 6.4. That is quite low because China is having a huge size of the population. So when you take into total carbon emission divided of the people per capita, it's become quite low. And people living below the poverty line, it is 3.1%. People living below the poverty line, and the people, those who are sharing earning less than $2, only 0.7% of the population. India is also another fast growing country, but our per capita energy consumption is quite low. It is only 559.6 kilowatts per person annually. Quite low, and our GDP simultaneously quite low. That is $2,015.6 per year. That is per capita GDP, and our CO2 world share only 7%. Per person only 1.62%. But we have higher number of the people living below the poverty line. That is 21.9% people live below the poverty line. If we go to the urban area, rural areas, it is quite higher. It is 28% people living below the poverty line. and the people earning less than $2 a day, they become 12% of the population. So it comes closer to the conclusion is that higher the amount of energy consumption, higher is the GDP, more contribution to the carbon emission, that is more contribution to the pollution. On the other hand, lesser per capita energy consumption links to lesser GDP and simultaneously less contribution to pollution, but simultaneously it links to the existence of higher number of people living below the poverty line. So what we talk about, the development is linked to pollution, development is linked to one way or the other the higher amount of GDP, and underdevelopment linked to lower earning and simultaneously more concentration of the people living below the poverty line. In this unequal world, there has been, when these are widely recognized, starting from late 70s, so people started thinking there should be rethinking the whole process of development. That developmental discourse started coming in from 1970s, that is social and human development. A new slogan came in, women's development, women and development, development as a freedom, development as happiness. Then came the whole slogan of sustainable development. So this kind of a buzzword which started coming in both in the national and international arena, it widely influenced the developmental practitioners and also social scientists and social activists alike. So when you talk about the gradual shift from development to social and human development, then human development to sustainable development, varieties of the scholars started contributing. Social development, when you talk about social development, has been a part of the UN Charter starting from 1948. Right to development, 1986, UNDP World Development Report starting from 1990-91. They put that human being at the center of all development. They talked about the economic growth is essential for human development, for social development, development of the people on this earth. But economic development or the growth development is only a means towards the end. It is not an end in itself. So what happened simultaneously, as they realized the huge kind of a distraction the growth-driven development has brought in on this earth. So starting from 1970s, the concern for environmental sustainability started getting expressed at various levels and various forums to ensure the sustainability of the earth. The Human Development Report widely expressed its concern in 1990s. It became quite vocal and is asserted that the whole growth-driven development, economic growth-driven development, industrialization-driven development, modernization-driven development, it has brought a kind of a jobless development, voiceless development, and futureless development on this earth. So they talked about that there is to be a concern for environmental sustainability. That sustainability started becoming one of the major developmental thinkers. Many scholars found that at that level, the Western economy means West European economy of America. The Western economic and technological model is a highly material and energy incentive. It metabolizes huge quantities of natural resources and leaves a trail of toxins and destruction on this earth. So what is important is that this realization, it has not come all of a sudden. It has come out of critiquing the developmental process and empirically realizing what has been the linkages between the development, underdevelopment, environmental sustainability, and also environmental distraction on this earth. So when we talk about sustainable development, we have to conceptualize, how we'll conceptualize sustainable development. That is, it is widely talked about by scholars like Irendo and Woodgate, where they talked about the modern industrial form of production induced increasingly severe degrees of social inequality and growing environmental instability and degradation, which together have recently been conceptualized as crisis of modernity. When you talk about modernity, modernity started coming in from the mid 18th century. People started talking of in terms of new kind of morality, new kind of reasoning on this earth, and everything will be critically looked into. The equality, fraternity, justice, and citizenship rights will be asserted, and that assertion will be widely promoted by interpenetration of economic development, growth-driven development, industrialization. It was widely thought of, but that has brought a distraction on this earth in its onward march through giving a lot of emphasis on the machines, money, and growth-driven development. It also recognizes that the Western developmental model, in its most triumphant movement, appears to be neither desirable nor universally applicable because it is simply not sustainable. So Western development, as you told, it has brought a crisis. It is described as the crisis of modernity. It's also simultaneously, it has been destructive and undesirable. It has proved to be unsustainable in this earth. So at this level, if that is a critiquing of this Western model of development, what are the alternative models of development? How we look into it? This widely, we can look into our common future, that is the UN document, widely conceptualizes. It is widely used. Sustainable development is the development that meets the need of the present generation without compromising ability of the need and ability of the future generation to meet their future need. So what essentially it is talking about, sustainable development will meet the need of the present generation without compromising the need of the future generation. So you were to live, also you were to let the other generation live. So if you were to let the other generation live, you are to live the environment, the nature, the mother earth, is water, is forest, its soil, its air, to remain intact, to remain not being mass polluted. So what is important, that an amount of sustainability is talking about in terms of sufficing the present need, simultaneously preserving the resources for the generation, those who are going to come in this earth in future. It contains within two key concepts, that is what is talking about concept of need of the particular essential generation, and also it is talking about the limitation imposed by the state of technology, social organization on the environmental stability to meet the present and the future need. So there are two important parts, that you have to meet the need. Need is when people is coming on this earth, they must be having the need of food, the shelter, the clothes, other kind of aspirational need. So, those are to be simultaneously, those can't be satisfied with the help of the modern technology only and modern organization. So we'll have to think something alternative. And what are those alternatives? How it can be thought of? And what are those concerns? So at this level, let us examine some of the global and international concerns for sustainable development. There are several conferences, seminars, international commission and committees, both by UNO and other civil society bodies. They have given varieties of the suggestions. This is widely debated across the world with the same notion of make the world sustainable and let there be sustainable development. So there has been a big concern about the development versus environment. It is widely thought of, as we talked about earlier. Development has been considered as antithesis to environment and antithesis to culture. But development and culture, development also part of a culture. If it is to be part of culture, what are the concerns? How those are to be integrated? So the famous Stockholm Conference 1972, the major concern it expressed, that is the modern industrial societies realize that there is only one world. That is quite, it is the modern world, but everybody is to be modernized. Everybody should have the path of Western way of life. When we talk about the modernization, we talk about a process, a kind of an epitome or a reference point, a kind of sophistication and technological advancement that has taken place in the Western Europe and North America in the 18th century and thereafter, and followed by rest of the countries thereafter. So if that is the modernization, they have looked into only one reference point of development, that is the Western world, the American world. But what it is talking about, there is a limitation, and a first official recognition of environmental deterioration, because this conference they recognize that there is a limitation of the present model of development, that is the only one unilineal, that is on the one pattern of development. Then the work of the Club of Rome, 1972-74, it talks about the limits of the growth. What it underlined, the realization of impossibility of infinite growth with finite resources. What is talked about, perhaps the growth will be infinite, that is, it will keep on growing, recognizing that other resources, other factors of production, land, labor, capital, organization, all are having its own kind of limitation. The land, the air, the water, the soil, the air, it's having its own kind of limitation. So it can't suffice the need. It's also the first official studies of global environmental degradation. So what we find, gradually a momentum is being made. Then the Global 2000, commissioned by President Carter, the American president, that is a big realization in that report, the realization that northern lifestyle cannot be reproduced globally. The northern lifestyle, affluent lifestyle, it can't be reproduced globally, and also it can be reproduced equally. So it was also the first diagnosis of the causes of global environmental degradation. The tacit underlining of this fact is that global lifestyle, the northern lifestyle, or that neither sustaining nor sustainable, because it is founded on environmental degradation. So it recognized the deterioration of the environment. Then the World Conservation Strategy, it's also published in 2002. It talked about the nature conservation can be achieved regardless of the world diversity. So it talked about there is a possibility of regeneration of this earth, and that can be done collectively. Then we find varieties of the other kind of global level discussion and concern were expressed. That is World Commission on Environment and Development, that is our common future, is widely quoted. The first official definition of the concept of sustainable development, as I told earlier, it is widely given. It is the first suggestion of an international strategy for confronting the crisis of modernity, because it is the modernity that brought a new kind of a culture of development, and that culture of development, now it is being questioned. So what are the alternatives? Then also we find the carrying the earth, another perspective. Then United Nations Conference on Environment and Development and the Earth Summit, that is the Earth Charter was prepared. The Agenda 21 we talk about, a code of a human conduct of the 21st century, it was widely delineated. So what we find, the global concern on the growth-driven development, global critiquing on the growth-driven development became quite explicit gradually. Now the sustainable development goal that is talked about, that is, what is a sustainable development we are talking about? Sustainable development we are talking about meeting the need of the present generation without compromising with the need of the future generation. So those goals are to be met in some of the specific 17 areas. It will eliminate the poverty. That is, nobody should live below the poverty line. Nobody should live without hunger. So no poverty, no hunger. So development would be sustainable. No development can be sustainable when the huge quantum of the people live below the poverty line and live in this earth with hunger. You may be knowing that, as you told earlier, 22% of Indian people live below the poverty line, and 19% of Indian people go to the bed without having sufficient food on the stomach. So we are having hunger index and poverty index on this earth. Those are to be eliminated with the whole perspective of sustainable development. There is a need of good health and well-being. Good health, that everybody should have not only longevity of life, it should have least quantum of illness on this earth also should have a kind of a illness, well-being, social well-being, mental well-being. Social well-being means a sense of fellow feeling for the others, and also mental well-being, a kind of a sense of enjoyment of the life, engaging with the life. It should also talk about the quality of education, that is, everybody should get access over a quality education that will promote the process of their mobility in the society. That educational quality is also linked to the linkage between environment and culture. So it will not be simply a kind of an educational perspective that will be leading to growth-driven development, but it will have amount of sensitivity towards the nature and towards the culture. It will ensure the gender equality in the society. It will talk about everybody getting access to clean water and sanitation facilities. Energy and clean energy, this is another requirement on this earth. So everybody should get the clean energy. Similarly, it documents that the decent work and the economic growth, everybody should be the beneficiaries of decent work. That is not that a huge, still now in India, 48% of the people are engaged in agriculture and their working conditions are pathetic. Dirty hands, muddy legs, all through the work, and those they can be brought in to a more productive work, and agricultural work can be more mechanized so that there is more human value attached to agricultural production, and that leads to economic growth. So there should be more and more interlinkage between innovation and industry. There should be reducing inequality. When we talk about the reducing inequality and sustainable growth, we talk about income, not that income parity, rather let everybody get a decent working environment, and within this decent working environment, people will be, that income inequality will be reduced, and everybody will have that possibilities of choice and mobility in the society. And we should have sustainable cities. That is, cities are not to be decided only in terms of concentration of certain number of population and with non-agricultural activities. It should have a kind of sustainable cities with more and more urban amenities, more facilities of education, health, and other kind of occupational, professional, and aspirational requirement. It's also talked about the reasonable consumption. Consumption, once growing, the consumption should not be ruthless. Consumption should not be without concern. So it should be a consumption with a concern, so that concern is reflected in terms of environmental sustainability. So we are having more and more car on the road. Many a time, cars are the symbols of one's status in the society, but cars should be used only as a part of minimum requirement, as a reasonable, so that emission of pollution, emission of CO2 is become least on the earth. So what we call simultaneously, there should be climate action both at the local and the global level. And also simultaneously, there should be life below the water, that is the sea life, underwater life, that should be taken care of. Life on land, that is the forest, the animal population to be taken care of. Then the peace, justice for the world is to be looked into. Then we talked about in terms of protection of this earth from all kind of ailment that is to be taken care of. So again, further, UN also widely talked about the UN 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development. It's specifically focusing, keeping that 17 agenda in action, people at the center of all kind of development. It is not the market. It is not industry. It is not agriculture. What is important is to bring people at the center of all development. Whatsoever the economic growth, whatsoever the modernization, modernity, globalization, everything to be centered to promote the people's association with the nature, people's well-being, people's own sense of realization, own sense of gratification, being a human being, that should be brought in the center of all developmental perspective. And when those developmental perspective becoming people-centric, it should also take care of the planet. The natural resources should be looked into in such a way that it is looking into the need of the contemporary generation, simultaneously keeping those natural resources preserved for the future generation to come. A kind of linkages between the present and the future. And when we're talking about the present and future, it is linked to the not only the people, also in terms of the well-being of the planet with its all natural resources. Then we are talking of the prosperity, the global agenda prosperity. It is talking about you have to bring everybody above the poverty line, and everybody should get the sense of prosperity in terms of education, employment, mental and social being, so that it comes to the third point, a kind of a peace across the globe. That is, people are contributing in terms of one's need, contributing in terms of one's capacity and taking in terms of one's need. So what a kind of a peaceful society that is people-centric, planet concerned, prosperity oriented and peace driven. And simultaneously, it is developing a kind of a partnership. There can't be people-centric development and preservation of the earth, prosperity and peace in the society without partnership. So there will be more and more partnership from community to community, from society to society, from state to state, from nation to nation and across the globe. So the linkages of partnership should grow across the globe, and that should be people driven. So here are the agenda of sustainable development of 2030 as given by UNO. Now, what is the need at this level when you are talking about the sustainable development need of 2030? So there is enormous need, that is reinventing the linkage between the nature, culture and human being. The major destruction of this earth and CO2 emission, other kind of pollution, it has come in this society when the human beings started thinking that they are not part of the nature, they are human, others are part of nature. Human beings are also part of a nature. Human beings, besides being part of a nature, they are also part of a culture. Culture is a construction that is constructed based on certain historicity, taking the resources, present resources into consideration. This simultaneously transmits to the next generation. So a human being stands in between the nature and the culture. So human being is to take care of, develop that linkage between the nature and culture, being sensitive to the nature and being sensitive whatsoever they have inherited, what are the responsibilities in the future. So human beings are to reposition themselves in terms of cultural requirement of the society and sensitivity to the nature. Second, it is to look into the forgotten reality of the modernity is that when we think, many times we think, look into the newspaper, that is modernization and industrialization has brought varieties of the challenges on this earth. But that is not realized. It is said. What is important is that is to be realized, that the modernity has brought. What is the modernity? Modernity is not a curse on this earth. Over modernization, over consumption, at the cost of the nature, that is a kind of a destruction on this earth. So what is important is that the forgotten modernity of the forgotten reality of the modernity to be brought in the forefront, where everybody will realize the one usually talked about one of the African tribe, that is when you talk about that, when the last tree of the earth will be cut, when the last fish will be caught and the last river will be poisoned, only then man will realize that we can live only by eating money. Because it is the modernization, it is the industrialization has given the people more and more economic growth, more and more money in their hand. But money, they can purchase more consumption need. They can go any parts of the world, but it is also having a limitation, because to suffice the last of human being, the consumption need, trees are required to be cut, fish are to be caught, the river are to be poisoned. So the tribal man is widely saying, when the last tree of this earth will be cut, when the last fish will be caught, the last river will be poisoned, only then human being will realize that man can live on this earth only by eating money. So it needs a kind of a repositioning human being in their relationship on this earth. It's also linked to what Mahatma Gandhi gave a wide dictum that is talked about. The Mother Earth is having everything to give a human being. Mother Earth is having the capacity to give everything to human being, but what makes the difference between the need and the greed. The Mother Earth is having everything to meet the need of each and every human being, but not their greed. So what is important? There is a need of revisiting human need, not in terms of human greed. So what is important at the level of realization of the linkages between nature, culture and human being, realization of forgotten reality of the modernity, and also realization of what Mahatma Gandhi said in terms of living in terms of need, not in terms of greed. So at this level, let us try to talk about what can be at this kind of social, sustainable developmental perspective as a creative, what can be the nature of sociological intervention. Sociological intervention can be in three forms. One is that as a social analyst, he can simply analyze, okay, this is a developmental trajectory, it has changed from one stage to that of another. So as a public intellectual, they can bring about those kind of anomalies and inconsistencies to the public domain for critiquing. Second is that they can also be an applied sociologist. They can look into the sociological tools and techniques that can be used to the solution of the developmental problems, developmental anomalies, and simultaneously they can also be social activists. There is a possibility a good number of the sociologists or social activists, they can contribute towards to bring a change in the dynamics of development in society. So they are having three roles they can play as a social analyst, applied sociologist, and social activist. They can critique the development and consumption. So what is important is that there is a need of critiquing. Critiquing is important to develop a critical mass. They will develop a sense of critical approach towards the development, towards the consumption. Those who are in terms of need, those who are in terms of greed. So those kind of a simplicity should not be looked into as a kind of weakness. Simple consumption may be looked into in terms of a sign of strength. So what is important? The strength and weakness in terms of consumption, in terms of development, those are to be looked into by redefining the cultural perspective. So simultaneously there is a need in terms of documenting the success stories based on the ethno and the indigenous development. Varieties of ethno development, that is ethnocentric development, and also indigenous models of development taking place across the country. Those required to be documented and needs be replicated, but part of the development strategy of the state and society. So what is important that a kind of linkage is to be done in terms of the research and its wide dissemination of the finding of the research, and also in terms of applying those perspectives. Now, there is also inculcating a social and moral responsibility of sustainable development. What is moral responsibility and social responsibility? Many a time it is talked about if the earth is to be looked into, it's a kind of a moral concern. It becomes a moral concern the way Durkheim widely talks about what is society. Society is a kind of a collective conscience. That collective conscience to be looked into in terms of a moral responsibility and sustainability of living. So in terms of its division of labor, what are those specificities required? Division of labor for the sociologists to look into how they can inculcate a kind of a moral responsibility and social responsibility towards a sustainable development in the society through their analytical capability, their capability as an applied sociologist, at times as social activist. So what is important is that they can also simultaneously develop a kind of a linkages with the social and academic network for sustainable development. That networking may be from local to regional, regional to national, national to international, then global. There is a possibility that sustainable development network is to be developed through environmental concern, through humanitarian concern. So all those concerns can be interlinked. Until unless those are interlinkages, there are kind of a sharing of information, alternative perspective, it becomes quite limiting. So to break the barriers of those limitations, what is important? There should be free flow exchange of ideas and information through global and local networking. As the Sustainable Development Goal 2020 talks about, Sustainable Development 2030 talks about, those linkages for a humanitarian concern, those are to be looked into. So at this stage, let us have a recap that what we have said so far. In this discussion, we have talked about widely the trajectories of development, how this growth trajectory of development brought on this earth in terms of first expansion of capitalism and also three ideology development world, first world, second world and the third world. Those are widely linked to growth driven development. So it is also widely talked about limitations of the growth driven development, that is how it has brought varieties of anomalies and developmental imbalances and challenges on this earth. Then development, the growth driven development is linked to energy consumption. Energy consumption widely linked to economic growth. That's also linked to unequal and imbalanced growth on this earth we have talked about. Lastly, we have talked about the global concern for environmental sustainability and sustainable development. Then lastly, we have talked about what could be nature of sociological intervention on this earth that we have talked about. So thank you very much for being with me and for being part of this lecture. Thank you.